let's look at this word evolution. There are two definitions in the Webster Dictionary. One, any process of formation or growth. Straightforward and simple. But the second one says, the continuous genetic adaptation of organisms or species to the environment by the integrating agencies of selection, hybridization, inbreeding, and mutation. What a tremendous sentence that is. A tremendous statement. It's some time now since I came across that particular definition, but it spurred me on to a deeper study as to how and where it fitted in with our concepts and teachings. That it did, I had not the slightest doubt. Now, not being, unfortunately, a physicist, a chemist, a biologist, or even a zoologist, I have restricted myself in the time allowed to highlighting three particular stages during evolution, which I personally think are of great interest to the layman, and to which we have not been given proper answers as yet. Certainly not satisfactory answers. So we're going to examine these three vague areas or gaps from the scientific view, influenced mainly by Western thinking, and occultism, influenced by Eastern thought. But there is a third factor, which has played a most powerful role in the shaping of Western man's thinking, and one that we cannot, but we must take into consideration. And this, of course, was the introduction of Christianity. And in fact, today, we are still hampered and confined by Christian and Judaic thought. Luckily, this was not always so. And long before Christianity made its appearance, there were many ancient Greek philosophers who spent their entire lives in the study of this vast area above and around them. In fact, it was the Greeks who named this seemingly empty void the cosmos, which means the universe viewed as an ordered and orderly system. And from the depths of their great minds, they had reached the concept of a progressive creation. One of these was Anaximander, who said in the 6th century BC that man was descended from a fish. And Empedocles in the 5th century BC, who announced that ere now he had been a boy, a girl, a bird, a bush, and a dumb fish in the sea. And there were several more down through the ages with this progressive idea. But once the Christian religion was introduced, any adverse opinion, contrary to the Bible teachings, was dealt with severely. And philosophers, some were imprisoned, tortured, and some even went to the stake. So therefore, this had the effect of discouraging the scholars, and very little literature was written or even discussed about evolution, except privately, or written in symbolic form that only those of a like mind would be able to understand. So up to the 19th century, the average person had no idea that there would be any fundamental change in the passing eons in a way that we would call today evolution. And then suddenly, the Judaic and Christian beliefs were shaken to their very foundations, and incidentally, never recovered. Because Charles Darwin, in 1858, with Alfred Russel Wallace, published their papers on evolution through natural selection, and a year later, he followed it with Origin of the Species. Darwin himself, a devout churchman, faced an inward battle with his conscience, trying to come to terms with this tremendous knowledge that everything was not created by God as we see it today, but had evolved from microscopic cells, that it had evolved through inbreeding, hybridization, and mutation. Darwin was also very aware that faith in the Bible as truth would be greatly undermined. And this has turned out to be very true. Because today, the Genesis version of creation and evolution are looked upon by many as merely a lot of legends and myths. And the scientists, with their materialistic views, particularly those that they held between the years 1860 to 1921, delivered the final blows. It's interesting, however, to learn that at least 4 American states have banned the teaching of scientific evolution from the school curriculum, and the Bible version is accepted to the letter. There are, of course, 2 versions of evolution in Genesis, separated only by a few chapters. It's accepted that the second version should really have been the first, but both are truly occult happenings. Unfortunately, the mistranslations from the book that they were originally copied from are far too many. The book was called the Book of Beginnings and was the ancient Hebrew scripture. Of course, we know that ancient Hebrew has no vowels, no punctuation marks, and is read from right to left, so that we can see that there was difficulty in translation. I'm not repeating the statements, those wonderful statements made in the opening chapters of Genesis concerning creation and evolution, because I know that all of you will have read them many, many times and pondered deeply over them. I think it is the stark simplicity of the wording which makes it difficult to realize the depths of the mystery. For example, let there be light, and there was light. We can understand the depth behind those few words. Now let's look at the basic scientific viewpoint. 50 years ago, the answers would have been very different. But tremendous discoveries have been made in the realms of science, astronomy, physics, and chemistry. In fact, are being made daily. With the help of computers, satellites, and space probes, there's new data being constantly accumulated about suns and stars and galaxies of which we have never known anything before. However, it is the physicist astronomer, I like to put these 2 words together, it is the physicist astronomer who is today laying down new concepts. The Big Bang Theory has been accepted by the scientist, the astronomer, and even the Catholic Church. The evidence that galaxies are rushing outwards in all directions has led the physicists now to believe that way back, billions of years ago, there must have been a much smaller beginning, and that the Big Bang was the explosion of an unknowable, heavy, dense, small conglomerate, which they now call the primeval atom. Now, out of this explosion came, they tell us, all matter. And 1 billion years later, the gravity of these dense compacted fragments drew to themselves helium and hydrogen. And these became clusters or lumps, which we now call galaxies. Now, the same type of process, was repeated again millions of years later on a much smaller scale, resulting in the birth of our sun. The burn-up, the explosion of a huge star, flinging its fragments out into space, these fragments collecting wisps of cosmic matter and gas to themselves, their heavy elements settling to the centers as nuclei and whirling now into circular motion. And one of these fragments became our sun. And then again, later, much later, the planets were subsequently formed because fragments again broke off the sun, and these fragments again collected other material and went into motion and became our planets. Now, that is a very, very brief explanation. Now, if we put the Genesis version alongside the scientific theories, allowing for vast eons of time instead of days, there are many similarities, particularly in the sequence of events. But the main difference is, of course, the fact that the Genesis evolution begins with the statement that God created the earth and every form upon it. It omits to tell us what did God create with, because as it stands, it appears to be from nothing. We'll come back to this later. Now, science starts with the assumption that the material or materials were already in existence, either distributed throughout the universe or concentrated at one point. The building blocks of the universe, or, as they now believe, the primeval atom. Science accepts that they were there, but cannot explain their ultimate origin. When looking at evolution from the religious point of view, we always allow for certain mysterious gaps because of the divine and ancient sources of knowledge. But we question the scientist and his theories if the information seems vague or non-existent. So the first gap falls between the area of that darkness or nothingness before manifestation began and the time science begins its theories. Professor Lovell of the Jodrell Bank fame was once asked about what did he think happened before the Big Bang, and he said, well, that was the borders of physical things and metaphysical things, and that was all. He did say that he believed in a creator, but that was as far as he went. Now, clearly, there is a great rift between the spiritual truth as presented by religion and the objects described by the scientists. Scientific evolution is an approach from matter, and, of course, the religious one, the exact opposite. Yet, Dr. Albert Einstein said that science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind. Now, much, much later, when our planet Earth was only in its infancy, about 1 billion years ago, science believes that she was barren. There was nothing we would call life. The rocks were there, exceedingly hot, and most of the area was covered with hot, sticky, slimy, steaming pools of mud. And the atmosphere is thought to have been mostly ammonia fumes, methane, chlorine, and sulfur. Now, if we would have been there at the time to look at this landscape with its hissing and its writhing, its volcanoes, its clouds of this deadly gas that I've just mentioned, plus the acid rain which these gases would accumulate, pouring down non-stop for thousands and thousands of years, it would have been impossible to believe that this fatal concoction, left long enough to itself, would one day produce a thinking man. The next stage, we're told by the scientists, was that the waters gathered together, forming oceans and seas. More familiar gases appeared: hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon, and oxygen. And all these entered into certain combinations. And soon, reed-like plants, which we call algae, started to form in the sticky, slimy pools. Protoplasm, the first form of life. Now, science tells us that two activities would be noticeable from the very beginning in this living matter. One, that the organism keeps its life as long as possible by feeding, nutrition. And the other activity is the production of another organism similar to itself, reproduction. Now, under these two instincts, nutrition and reproduction, matter will evolve. This process continues slowly, stage by stage, from its humble beginnings, and each successive stage is developed from its predecessor, and each will be more evolved than what has gone before, as it is at this very moment in time. Each cell carried within itself the knowledge of its exact function. Some were to combine to form rock, then to advance to minerals, and then to crystals. Eons later, some were to combine to form plant and vegetable life, again from the lowliest mosses to the majesty of those redwood pines in Teckles Park. And much, much later came the animals, again from crude forms to the beauty and intelligence of an Arab stallion. Now, all these stages took millions and millions of years and fall into the timetables of the geologist. These eras, as they are called by the geologists, are quite separate one from another and are bounded by great changes, both in the physical appearance of the Earth and in its life. Now, during the formation of the oceans, a second gap or mystery occurs. Because somewhere in those early warm oceans, atoms and molecules were brought together in an even more complex fashion, and a new element appeared, which we call consciousness. There has to be consciousness to hold materials together and direct their activities. Again, science cannot answer this question of the source and nature of consciousness. Now, granted that this consciousness appeared, we see an unfolding panorama of evolution, fascinating forms in the plant and animal kingdoms. And over millions of years, endless varieties of living forms were produced, each holding a position either on the main trunk or on a side branch of that tree of evolution. Just a few quick examples to boggle your minds as regards variety. There are 100,000 species of flies, 280,000 species of beetles, and 9,000 species of birds, on which live 26,000 species of feather-eating parasites. The more one studies the variety of evolutionary life, the more one is filled with wonder. With what care does nature look after these units of life that it has selected out of the long struggle for survival? I was always puzzled when reading Darwin's Origin of Species, because I wondered what laws governed the decisions to snuff out certain species. I felt that it must be more than just the law of the survival of the fittest, or the climate, or even the whims of a capricious creator. And then, about 4 years ago, I was lucky enough to come across an article written in a book by Rohit Mehta. And for the first time, I was able to understand just a little clearer this wonderful evolution that takes place because of selection and variation. And at this stage in the talk, it is essential that we just try to understand a little about variation and selection. Variations take place in the sphere of evolutionary continuity. They do not constitute fundamental changes in the species, but are only a modification of the preceding state. A new variation deviates as little as possible from its established pattern. So if heredity, for example, represents a continuity in evolution, variation denotes a modified continuity. Variation is the product of acquired characteristics. It's more or less recognized today by physical science that acquired characteristics are not transmitted from generation to generation. In other words, variation does not affect heredity. It brings practically no alteration in the composition of the hereditary factor. We as theosophists, can agree with this to a certain extent because of karmic law. I'll mention in the group discussions about a variation which has taken place in the last 100 years. But if the new heritable factors are not created, how is evolution to proceed? no fundamental changes would occur in evolution. And so the arrival of an entirely new type of life implies a change in the very constitutional factors of humanity and heredity. Variation and natural selection fail to give a satisfactory answer. There is no doubt that the key to the understanding of evolution lies in the factors which bring new types of life into existence, and not just varieties of the existing life. So where do we start? It is evident that only in the factors that cause alteration can we find the key to the understanding of new types coming into existence. And such an alteration is called a mutation. That's in the language of biology. A more common name is break. I was reading the gardening page, and the first paragraph stated that plants sometimes just happen. We call them breaks or sports, but the great majority are patiently evolved by plant breeders to form a variation. And we know this. We know of gardeners who spend their whole lives to produce a new rose. New shape, maybe. New colour, yes. New perfume, yes. But still only a rose. According to G.N. Ridley, the biologist, he sees in mutation the raw material of the universe. And that's very true. But what is a mutation, and how does it work? Well, I can only tell you, in the way that as I understand it, that it's been described as a discontinued variation. And according to this, the element of discontinuity is one of the most important factors constituting a mutation. So while variation is only a modification, a mere fluctuation in the realm of heredity, mutation is a fundamental change affecting the very constitution of the unit of life. You will therefore see that a mutation is not the product of gradual adaptation to new environment. It's been described as a sudden and spontaneous arrival of a new species. Suddenness and spontaneity are the most important factors. And in more simple terms, while in variation nature moves slowly along this line of continuity, in mutation it takes jumps. And it is these jumps that enable fundamental changes possible in evolution. It is these jumps or gaps between the species which hold the key to the understanding of evolution. For it is in these gaps that new lines of growth appear. Discontinuity, not continuity, is the secret. It's also needless to say that these jumps are outside the law of probability. While variations can be predicted within the law, any attempt to predict the phenomenon of a mutation is self-defeating, for there is no explanation for the discontinuity in the sphere of continuity. Now, there are minor and major mutations. Minor mutations are those which occur within the same kingdom of nature. For example, the emergence of birds and mammals from reptilian creatures constitute a minor mutation. But the emergence of the vegetable kingdom from the mineral kingdom, and the animal kingdom from the vegetable kingdom, and the arrival of humanity from the animal kingdom, these indeed are major mutations, and the geological eras bear this out. Another important fact that we should notice in mutation is that it does not appear among well-adapted, stable organisms, but arises in the inconspicuous organisms, In other words, they don't emerge out of the successful units of life. In fact, mutation arises in organisms that are, as it were, rejected. The successful units of life, being well adapted to their environment, bring that particular evolutionary line to a particular point and then stagnate. So during the line of continuity, the successful units of life, dominate the evolutionary scene. But as they cannot produce new heritable properties, they become merely the leftovers of a vanished past, like the dinosaurs and all the other giants of prehistory. The so-called masterpieces become the leftovers of evolution. Now, what is the ingredient that brings about these fundamental transformations in nature? Why is science unable to fully explain the phenomenon of mutation? The how and why of this factor, which holds the key to evolution. Let us look to the occultist for an answer. And the answer can be given in 4 words, just 4 words. Science still ignores consciousness, which is the informing principle of all life, no matter how primitive they are. And you know, when a scientist does stumble onto something of this nature, maybe the nature of consciousness, he wants to measure it and weigh it and label it. And this cannot be done. Many don't realize that they have caught a glimpse or had an intuitional flash at metaphysical levels, and that there are states of matter and states of consciousness of which they are completely unaware. One may describe this consciousness, we say in one of the books, as intelligence in nature, and Dr. Raynor Johnson calls it mind in matter. And Annie Besant says that consciousness and life are identical. Consciousness turned inwards, she calls life, and life turned outwards, she calls consciousness. Inward turned, it's a state of pure being, and outward turned, it is the state of existence. It is consciousness alone that can explain mutations. Minor mutations show minor jumps in consciousness, and major mutations indicate major jumps in consciousness. As I said a moment or two ago, as long as physical science does not take into consideration these changes in consciousness, a true understanding of mutation will not be possible. Occultism teaches that consciousness is inherent in all matter. It is in the rocks and the minerals, only weak, but it can be awakened by outside agencies. It is stronger in the vegetable kingdom. It's been proven that plants respond to love and affection, and many of us, I'm sure, talk to our flowers. It's very strong in the animal kingdom, as our domesticated house pets demonstrate to us so often. There is no form which does not have a consciousness at its own level. Now, what I've been talking about leads to the third gap, also still a mystery, the so-called missing link. Now, due to Darwin's theory, scientists have been telling man that he is descended from apes. And when H.P.B. refuted this, she was ridiculed. Think about it. When did apes make their own bows and arrows? When did apes paint pictures of themselves on cave walls? But, however, we have to admit that there are now several books in bookshops pointing out that man does have his own line of involution and evolution. And I'm not just referring to our theosophical books. It's very tantalizing, but it seems to be the case that the beginning of things always seems to be very obscure, even completely obliterated. Teilhard de Chardin, in his book, Man's Place in Nature, says, just as with any other living form, we must realize that the very earliest human origins can never be the object of direct experiential knowledge because of their very nature. In other words, you can never get hold of the real beginning of anything. However, we have many theosophical books in which these early forms, the anthropoids, the pithecanthropus, the Peking man, the Neanderthal man, the beaker man, all of these are discussed at great length in places in the Secret Doctrine and in the Earth and its cycles, and of course in other types of books. Very fascinating period of our evolution. But from the occultist point of view, we say the mutation which man fundamentally is points to the fact of not merely a jump in consciousness, but also a major transformation in structure. Nature has taken an enormous jump. Man is not the product of continuity. He is the result of a discontinuous jump. In fact, so vast is this staggering gulf between apes and man, particularly in the realm of intelligence, that even Julian Huxley admitted that the great jump could have taken place only once, and that it would probably never take place again. In other words, man was a special creation. In a sentence, no actually living form is the direct descendant of another. It is impossible to find the missing link in our physical world. Note I say in our physical world. The jump of consciousness has been so enormous that no intermediary structure can be found. The animal kingdom branched off from the true human stem about 18 million years ago, in what is we call the Miocene period, the truly human form being finally produced after the separation of the sexes, and the human consciousness then entering this form. As theosophists, we are would-be occultists, seekers after hidden spiritual truth and wisdom. Our founder, H.P.B., was the greatest occultist of her time. She was chosen by the masters to give this knowledge to the Western world for the first time. It was divulged to her occultly. She saw the books and manuscripts which were shown to her, clairvoyance. She heard the voices speaking to her, clairaudience. And she was able to read the Akashic records, which are waves on the ether in which everything is recorded. And what does the ageless wisdom that she gave us teach us about evolution? The fundamental fact of the conception of evolution is covered by one word, emanation. The flowing forth from an absolute to all the lower stages of the hierarchical structures, which we call cosmic planes, spheres, or levels. Bringing into manifestation, coming into perceivable view, whether it be a galaxy or a solar system. We usually see diagrams in some of the older theosophical books showing the absolute with the two poles, the positive pole and the negative pole of spirit and matter emerging, with the play between them both, bringing in the third factor of consciousness, divine consciousness. This triad, of course, being repeated all the way down through the descent at all levels. I'm just going to try to bring that same thing out in using slightly different words in the light of today's science. The absolute, or the supreme intelligence, emanates tiny particles. And these particles have consciousness. And therefore, they can be directed into certain patterns. And because they are eternal, they can be used over and over again. Each time they flow forth from the absolute, they contain a little higher consciousness than what they had the time before. From the moment that the emanation begins, evolution likewise begins its work of growth, of unfolding inner faculties and organs from the preceding seeds. And down through every level, the will of the Absolute makes itself known. And at each level, there is a lower, but still glorious, intelligent being, or deity, entrusted to carry out the next stage of emanation by rearranging the patterns or combinations, as far as we understand, by nuclear action. So after billions of years of unfolding down through cosmic levels, galaxies, galaxial levels of which we know nothing, we finally come to the particular galaxial deity just prior to our solar plane. This great being unfolds from himself the solar logos, or the solar deity. And it is this solar Lord who will, from the unmanifested state of his great consciousness, bring into being the altered pattern of our solar system, while still keeping to the blueprint of the Absolute's wishes. He is also aided by hierarchies of builders, great beings as well, who are evolved specially to carry out this great work of patterning and altering and coordinating in different ways. We mustn't forget this awesome knowledge that our planet Earth and the other planets in our system are held in thought by the will of the solar Lord. Were he to lose his concentration, this planet would vanish. And that the whole of manifestation is held in thought by the Absolute. Contrary to materialistic views, there are no extra cosmic gods working anywhere. There are no cosmic gods working on matter outside of the framework of the cosmic order. Whatever inspires or invigorates a solar system or any factor of it lives in and works through it. Now we can understand, in the light of this knowledge, that God in Genesis did not create out of nothing. The root spirit and root substance were already evolved into particles, becoming eventually protons, neutrons, atoms and molecules. And as I said, these particles are eternal. Therefore, there was nothing really to create as we use that word, create. The scientist was right for the same reason. The building materials were there, but he still doesn't understand how they got there, nor does he understand that it is the solar logos who will bring this solar system into being. And this is the fundamental difference between the scientific view and the occultist view. The Genesis beginning and the theosophical beginnings are similar. The void, the darkness, the deep, meaning space, the Spirit of God moved on the waters, and in theosophy, the solar logos breathed out into this void the breath of his creative energies, and a kind of plastic essence filled the space where the solar system was to be. And cosmic motion started, the cosmic dance of these particles, all forming themselves and arranging themselves into a pattern of creation. And millions of years later, these clusters became evolved enough to start their own cosmic pattern again. And so they whirled in circular directions like wheels to eventually form the planets. So the unfolding eons see each planet with its planetary lord in charge descending into manifestation. And each planet has 7 main levels of descent or unfoldment. And at each level, the spark of divinity has to use the type of matter available at that level in order to clothe itself, to have a vehicle or a covering. So our appearance has changed many, many times before we reached the dense physical level of our planet Earth. From ethereal spheroid shapes to ovoid shapes, the gradual evolution of eyes, ears, a larynx to speak with, until at this present moment in time, we have a physical body which we can see, feel, and touch. A body of bone, tissue, and muscle, and blood, all evolved by psychomagnetic attraction. Every atom in the cells, as our bodies are being formed in the womb, know to which part they are, which of these functions they are going to take place in. This process of descent is called in theosophy involution, but it leads to great evolution. And the bodies that we've ended up with at the present moment in time are marvelous pieces of machinery, replicas of the solar system in miniature. Most people take a great deal of care of these physical bodies. In fact, most of us indulge them to a high degree, one way or another. But man has pushed and trained his body to do many marvelous things. Even 50 years ago, some of the things that we do today would not have been believed. Walking in space, running a mile in 3 minutes, working at great depths under the sea. All very marvelous. But man was given a mind and a spirit during his evolution and involution. And far from evolving them, he has let his higher mind stay 4/5 unconscious. And as for his higher self, man has forgotten who he is. He's sunk in the personality, the I. And as he sinks deeper and deeper into materialism, the divine intelligence that he started out with is proportionately paralyzed. We have evolved through many great races and many sub-races, all on different levels, different rungs of the ladder in spiritual evolution. And along with the evolution of the race goes an evolution of the consciousness, which should be expanding to provide new functions. The function of this 5th root race is to evolve mind and the social sense. Lower mind is developing at an unprecedented rate, but it is refusing to allow the higher mind a hearing, and therefore we are separated from our higher self. Fellow pilgrims, what has been the purpose of your journey? Why are you here? And where are you going? The Christian pilgrim will say that he believes God created him as a new soul for this lifetime only. That he lives on earth but once. That his purpose is to love God and to serve him. To be reborn in Christ. To do battle daily with evil. And to put his life in God's hands. If he succeeds in overcoming evil and asks God's forgiveness for his sins, he will go to heaven after death and judgment and live in eternal bliss with his loved ones forevermore. Or he will be punished and maybe go to the other place. The scientist, what does he think he's made this journey for? And where does he expect to go? The first part of the question is to continue to evolve physically and mentally. It's recognized, however, that the human physical form is about as perfect as it can be. There are some ideas that the shape of the head may alter at some future time into a more dome shape to allow for expansion of brain. It's also thought that in thousands of years' time, some of our limbs may become atrophied, particularly our legs, due to the fact that over the next few thousands of years we are using transport more and more, and people are walking less and less. We are getting to the stage when we can sit in a chair at home and do our shopping and change the television programs and, in fact, lead our whole life from a chair. So we wonder what life will be like in 500 or 1,000 years' time as regards our physical form. But, you know, it is in the mind that most changes will occur. Psychic faculties of all kinds will appear. ESP, with telepathy, the telekinesis, clairvoyance will all be natural attributes of our sixth sub-race man. And where does the scientist believe he's going to after death? Well, they're divided. Half of them think that there is nothing after death, that they are snuffed out like a candle, and the others have some form of belief of life after death. Now, what about the theosophist? No hedging about here, or there shouldn't be. But there should be, we should all be able to give a clear answer in the light of occultism. The divine spark within us, the real I, has made this pilgrimage for a very definite reason. To evolve from divine, spiritual, pure unconsciousness to divine, perfect, pure consciousness. What do we mean by this? It means that as long as we are existing within God, or the divine Logos, we are pure spirit, but without experience. In other words, whilst this state would be pure bliss, our evolution would be static, and there could be no liberation. So God's plan for man is to send him out to gain experience. And having gained these experiences through many lifetimes, to return home in complete control of matter and consciousness at all the levels he has evolved through. In order to do all this, has man made this pilgrimage to the lowest physical depth, because only in the dense physical world can the experience of duality be gained. Every single thought, feeling, and action at this physical level has an opposite, and man has to make the choice. And depending on his choice, he gains experience. And experience is food to the soul's growth. This right thought, right action, right mindfulness is not possible in one lifetime. Each life is as a day in the school of eternal life. And where are we going? This physical world of ours is only the halfway house. We must now start the return journey. Back the same way as we came, but this time in conscious control of ourselves. When we have learned to control the physical body, we will leave it behind for good and live in the finer body of astral matter, shedding it again after many lifetimes when we are completely in control, and then changing again to the finer matter of the mental plane, ever getting nearer to perfection. I would like to finish on the most profound aspect of spiritual evolution. The average seeker cannot conceive that the solar logos, or God, in all his majesty, still needs to evolve. When we finally arrive back to our divine source, our Father, we bring with us the sum total of our experience through spiritually awakened consciousness. And just as we needed him to give us the very substance of life itself, the substance of our forms, to reach perfection, he needs us for the same reason. It is the divine spark in you and me who will eventually help this great being to evolve to higher regions. In the time process of the manifested universe, it is the Son, the cosmic logos, who is the informing active principle, unfolding into the lower galaxial and solar deities, and therefore has to be considered as differentiated from the one. In the New Testament, Corinthians, is a statement by Paul that needs meditating upon. When all things have been subjected unto him, then shall the Son, the Logos, also himself be subjected to him that did subject all things unto him, that God may be all in all. Evolution then marches on. Gods, solar systems, planets, man, nature, all on the evolutionary staircase to the God behind God, unknowable, eternal, invisible, one without beginning or end.